Hello. Thank you very much for your talk. It was like, honey for my ears, because this is what I teach, what I tell. And my question is, what is your impact, the impact of your discourse on scientists? I mean, we are here between social specialists of science, and we agree that science is a social discourse. But how do you manage to break into the epistemic community, or scientist? Are you treated as a researcher, as an intellectual, or as someone that does not understand what real science is, You understand what I mean?
Yes, I understand absolutely what you mean, and it's a very important question. And in my personal life, in my institution building efforts, I have had more support from scientists and engineers than I've had from any other academic discipline, and this is now true for 2 universities, both Cornell and Harvard. So at Harvard, the former dean of engineering is one of my closest colleagues, and for the last 4 to 5 years, we've been hiring a postdoc together to work between us, and he has become completely convinced that STS ought to exist somewhere in the Harvard spectrum as a field of academic engagement, and he's become persuaded of this through this kind of collaborative work. I also have very strong support from the Harvard climate science community and environmental community in general. Now, and at Cornell, which formed a new department of science and technology studies in 1991, the lineup at the upper reaches of the university at that time was that the president was a scientist, the provost was a scientist, the dean of the college was a scientist, and the head of my program before I joined it had been a scientist. And they all believed firmly that science, technology, and society was a field that needed to be investigated. And I will say that the foremost spokespersons for that view, who themselves were public scientists, they'd been in Washington and places like that, they thought that it should be a professionalized field. I still remember the person who founded the STS program at Cornell telling me when I became director of that program that this was their vision. Their vision was that eventually someday there would be professionals like me who made this their area of study, and this is how they evolved. Now, that said, I don't think that my eminent scientific colleagues who have personal trust in me understand what the field is trying to say. That is a different challenge, and it's a challenge that I think we have to recognize. So I think that behaviorist accounts of science do not carry weight with scientists if you deny the reality of their normative commitments. So if, for instance, you are not a Mertonian who they can understand and they buy into because this is the ethos of the practice of science that they've learned, but instead are an early Latourian and say, look, what scientists are doing is playing games with inscriptions, all they're doing is producing these things, and it's power that carries it and not the truth value. And above all, the subjectivity of the scientist doesn't matter in those accounts. Those read to scientists as, or at least scientists that I know, quite widely as, insults. Insults in almost the physical sense of an insult. So, to some degree, I find myself defending the field against some of its more catchy but necessarily reductionist accounts. In some sense, I find myself choosing a different discourse. So what hasn't been done, Sergio, is the whole field of STS communication. There's a lot of work invested in science communication and how scientists should speak clearly and simply and directly and avoid on the one hand and on the other hand, and sort of learn that people don't understand probabilities, so you should talk about a drop of alcohol in a bathtub and not 1 in a trillion. These kinds of sort of toolkit things that scientists are taught about how to communicate ideas to the public. Well, there is, of course, some truth to that. I mean, we talk differently to people who we think are strangers versus people who are close kin, differently to children from the way we talk to adults, so on and so forth. So I do think that STS scholars need to pay attention to, not the need to simplify. This is where I get annoyed. It's not about simplification. It's about encouraging understanding. I mean, so how do you evolve understanding with another person who is coming with different views from yourself? And I think that is, it's an ongoing struggle. I've got to the point where some of my scientist colleagues, I can give them some of my writings that I do explicitly in the science press, like occasional pieces in Nature or Science or whatever. And, it's partly to field test those items to see if they work. But those are written in a conceitedly different style from the things I write for academic social science use. And when I was hired at Harvard and there was a debate about whether I was too dangerous, I was told that two different people, one who favored my appointment and one who opposed my appointment, I wish I had been there. They were doing antiphonal readings from my own texts. She said this, but she said this. And then one person apparently said, well, she writes differently for scientists from what she writes for social scientists. Well, anyway, I mean, it's an object lesson in how it's not an easy row to hoe. But the general proposition that science and technology operate in society, are themselves social institutions and deserve study, for that I've found wide resonance among scientists and engineers, wide and unwavering. It's the content of what you find out when you get there that is sometimes a bit more controversial.
Tom Peterson from University of Victoria. I direct the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions, so I'm very interested in anything climatic. And in one of your earlier slides, you showed a survey, temporal time series from 1974 up to almost the present, showing the progressive decline in the conservative view of essentially the trustworthiness of scientists, whereas the liberals were at least constant or perhaps slightly going up.
Right.
Can you explain why that's happened and how that's happened in the United States? What the forces were that have driven particularly the conservative element toward that progressive decline?
Well, I have theories about it. So I think that the decline among conservatives is partly what STS scholars would understand well, that is a growing perception that science is not disinterested. To be sure, this is not symmetrically applied, but it's pretty widely understood that if you once discount the trustworthiness of a witness, then you end up not believing anything that's coming out of that witness, regardless. I mean, then, you can have yay good evidence. The best case I know about this, a sort of folktale kind of illustration, is the long, long trial of O.J. Simpson in the United States, which resulted in a jury verdict. The jury deliberated, as I recall, less than an hour. I mean, it was something ludicrous after 10 months of trial, and they exonerated him. And the evidence was pretty compelling. And people said, oh, they don't understand science. But I think that a far more fundamental threshold decision had been made, that LA people, especially people who were African Americans, did not trust the Los Angeles Police Department. So the LAPD had walked onto the stage as a corrupt witness to start with. Nothing they said could be believed. And therefore there was this long trial. But at the end of it, none of it mattered. I mean, just none. They had decided that this was a racist attack on one of their own, and they exonerated the guy. I think that with the conservative backing off, the perception that scientists are Democrats on the whole, which is true, by party affiliation, that they benefit from large science budgets, that they hobnob with the people who favor big government, and that big government in this case results in all these displacements that disempower people where they sit. These things, I think, are all extremely important. If you read the blogosphere, the charges that these scientists are corrupt and that they're in the pay of, pro-climate interests, that's very, very widespread. I haven't myself done the quantitative research to count how frequent or when this emerges as a theme, but I do know enough about that part of the blogosphere to know that this is a charge that emerges. And I think that once you undercut the disinterestedness of the science, then you're really up the creek. This is partly why I insist on the democratic virtues. I mean, this is partly why I want to say, look, don't stand only on the view that you are rendering the best science. Indeed, the best science got to be the best science in its own history of the Enlightenment by imitating the procedures of the law courts, of the common law courts, and holding up through a process of wide testing before the public, the fact that people bought into the story because it seemed credible in a public light. So, remember that heritage of empirical science and the experimental method sort of calquing itself on the back of common law, and not to forget that accountability matters at the end of the day. And therefore, I'm happy to go far out on a limb to say, look, democracy has been inventing these procedures of accountability. If you don't like them, quarrel with them, say what's wrong with them. But once we've agreed to these procedures, if we find a scientific body that is concededly expert, concededly representative of the right fields, but also adhering to these virtues of openness, transparency, critique, etc., then they've earned a multi-layered claim to trustworthiness. But don't forget the democratic virtues and only insist on epistemic superiority, that you're constructing this knowledge that is not given to others, because that rug can be pulled out from under somebody by showing interestedness, and interestedness takes many forms. For people who think that the Affordable Care Act in America is corrupt, those people don't think that industry funding is the corruption. They think government funding is the corruption. So you can't rely on, NSF's funding or the DOE's funding to rescue you in that context.
Thank you, Gordon. Well, I'm interested in the concept of accountability. And I think very few people would agree that we want accountability, that power should be matched to accountability. This is really not controversial. But when you look at accountability is implemented, for example, in a federal government, it often basically comes down to many rules, a lot of performance measurement, a lot of effort in building the indicators, a lot of bureaucracy in delivering the information, the evidence for accountability, sometimes leading to I believe, a perverse effect where people become risk averse, motionless, and basically refuse to use the power they may have because they rather be accountable, not be accused of abusing accountability. So how do you implement accountability in science without having this negative effect of massive bureaucracy, massive oversight, and so forth?
Thanks for the question. I don't think that STS is a field that can or should attempt to solve all problems of modernity that we have known deeply since Max Weber at the very least. And I think we should work with people like organizational sociologists and people who study innovation in firms and so on and so forth. So I think that the territory that STS people can reasonably hope to speak with special authority about is the epistemic and the artifactual and technological that goes with that epistemic as well. So that organizations develop tunnel vision and so on and so forth is sort of widely known and not something that we can cure, but to the extent that STS, because of its concern with the epistemic domain, has talked about the uses of reflexivity, the thinking about the assumptions underlying. There are places in institutional behavior where we can talk about what degree of reflexivity. So while I have not served in government and have no desire to, I have served on many, many National Academy committees, including committees that supervise risk assessment and risk regulation. And of course, that is a primary domain where you see the kind of paralysis and the kind of tunnel vision that you're describing. And one of the things that I've tried to do in those committees with my allies, my natural allies in those committee structures, is to think about how to push for reflexivity. So there was a report in 1996, for instance, which was conceitedly built as a rebuttal against the 1983 report that said risk assessment first, then risk management, then risk characterization and risk communication, and et cetera. Instead, it called for an analytic deliberative approach, and the report stressed that all analysis is based on framing, and that at times it would be necessary to go back and look for reframings. And then later there was one report that was produced more under the aegis of the Clean Air Act that was called something like Science and Judgment in Risk Assessment. So if you look at those reports, they're at least out there as documents that say that revisitation is necessary in some ways that have to be proceduralized. And of course the question was, well, when and how much, and isn't it too costly to go back and revisit everything? And yes, one has to have answers to that. Those are not particularly STS answers. I mean, and so yes, indicators. I mean, of course, there's, as you know, a whole branch of STS that studies the role of indicators, and maybe we should not, as STS scholars, get fixated on the piece of indicators that we have become very good at studying, namely how indicators reduce the world of complexity to render a simplistic measure which sometimes has perverse consequences. Maybe we should also devote some of our very considerable energy to thinking about the consequences, which are not just perverse because they remake the world in their own terms. That's, again, a well-understood phenomenon, though not well understood to everybody. I mean, well understood to STS scholars, certainly, but also how indicators operate in an organizational setting. That would require more context-sensitive STS, going back to the roots of science in society, as opposed to just studying science for its own sake as a productionist instrument. So I think there's work for us, but in the end, organizational problems are not going to go away. It's a question of what kinds of people we train to be good diagnosticians of where the problems are setting in. Organizations are like bodies, and maybe you want to detect the knee pain before it becomes a full-blown candidate for knee replacement. So how you have the people sitting in the organizations who are capable of diagnosing the symptoms of pathology before they become full-blown pathological. Here is where I think that coming with the kind of training that we might offer in STS might sensitize people. But I don't claim to have an arsenal of tools that will solve, really all the problems of modernity.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the nice talk. And for because of the things, I'm working for an agency that funds research for development. And I was really interested in your comments, Africa, and the way sometimes it's very mechanistic, the way your science is applied to development. And it happens from a context where, we're talking about the US, the UK, or Canada. You have strong institutions, that are communities that understand science, and they sort of debates. But when it comes, and I'm thinking on your last question here, in sort of context where those institutions are not present, but still, there is a drive in terms of using science as a sort of, this is a way for you to reach development, to address some of your problems, right? But when you have these kind of debates and the tension that you sort of express in terms of how do you conceive science and the role of science and citizenship, what would be the sort of reflections you would have in terms of linking then those actions into the development context where you have countries or areas where those institutions are not present, the communities are sort of weakly perceived or even trained in ways that we are sort of perceiving him becoming from units in the north, right? So I I would like to sort of see maybe that's maybe not really a concrete question, but just trying to understand the sort of what you have.
Yeah, no, thank you. Well, I think it's time to actually drop the word development from our vocabularies, because it just comes with so much baggage about the directionality in which you want to go. That somebody is developed and somebody else is developing, but that already sets up the linear scale of the directions in which you want to go. So, you know, one thing that I'm saying is that there are styles of scientific activity and styles of scientific thought, and when people say they're applying science to development, that is not a neutral statement. You have to ask, what style of scientific thinking are they taking out there? So there are places in our law and public policy, especially in international norms making, where we've recognized that there should not be, that we should not act as a world polity as if there's only one kind of way of not knowing. So in the Convention on Biological Diversity, the provision, not with many teeth to be sure, but nevertheless the recognition that indigenous knowledge should be given value and should be paid, and that extracting that value through a particular style of scientific production that depends on first reduction and then reintegration of that reduced knowledge, that this is not the only way to do it, that there are actually more holistic ways of knowing that may not propagate in the same way that modern science does, but that are entitled to respect anyway. I've had one eminent biologist in India complain about the Indian government's public policies towards biotechnology, saying that what this is doing systematically is dismantling the kind of knowledge and the kind of biological research which was much more based on whole systems knowledge in favor of running after somebody else's science, where India will never catch up because it doesn't have the labs and doesn't have the resources to innovate with the most specialized instruments and the most specialized labs. And he was saying, in the meantime, we're letting go of the kind of knowledge that we have been able to gather by having, in essence, public naturalists who are doing collecting on a wide scale. And so we're in danger of having neither the one nor the other. And what is that the result of? It's, in a way, the result of development. And it's the result of saying that agricultural development should follow the path trailblazed by Monsanto and not by some other means of agricultural intensification or biodiversity preservation or what have you. It's easy to say that there are multiple rationalities and multiple ways of knowing. It's very difficult to put into practice the kind of humility and modesty that would allow the successful modern science, which knows it's successful because it's conquered markets, not because it's conquered truths, but because it has also conquered markets and has money. It's hard to persuade that science that has not conquered markets and that's embedded in people and that's wrapped up in lifestyle is worth any respect whatsoever. You can go look at the STEP Centre in Sussex, run by the Institute for Development Studies and also the Science Policy Research Unit. It's now just called Science Policy Research, but anyway, SPRU, and look at their definition of pathways, which is a word that they have tried to revitalize as a theoretical term to suggest that if you cut into a society at a given moment, there are multiple pathways that could be followed, and that the story of development should be about maintaining the robustness of multiple pathways instead of focusing in on a single way as the best way. Again, this is at some level banal, but it's hard to put it into institutional practice when people have been taught that there is only this one right way, and it is the way that is all size fit, one size fits all for a very complex world. So I think development scientists ought to be taught technologies of humility, in my term.
We have time for a couple of more questions. Or none. Excuse me. And navigate.
Hi, I'm Rick French, professor of business and public policy at the Public Affairs School at this university. I started out my career in STS 45 years ago, and I've sinned by following other pathways. I wanted to go back to the first question that you had, because I thought it was an absolutely critical one. And I want to ask you whether you think natural scientists, in particular, read enough STS. That's to say, they believe strongly in evidence, but they have very little evidence, by and large, it seems to me, but their own prejudices with which to address the questions of science and society that are at the core of STS. This does not stop them from pronouncing large categorical judgments and even cultivating cults of the kind that you mentioned with respect to the lack of recognition for science. I just wonder if you could comment on that.
Thanks. In the first way that you put it, do they read enough STS? The answer is no. It's actually difficult, though, as an STS scholar who is committed to her field, to figure out what to do about this. So a couple of years ago, I was successful in the very first and most minimal attempt at curricular invasion at Harvard, and now there's a graduate minor in STS. But there are no warm bodies other than me hired to run that graduate minor, and I can only teach so many courses. So I'm supposed to teach 3 a year. In fact, I've always taught 4, plus done extra advising for which I don't get credit, and so on and so forth. I just don't have time to teach more than, a third more than I'm supposed to teach. Okay, so these young scientists who are very eager to do STS as a minor don't actually have what I consider an ideal course through which they can get led into thinking about STS more broadly. They can take my Science, Power and Politics graduate seminar, but it's pretty hardcore. It's hard going for people who've not read anything social sciencey, since probably they were seniors in high school and maybe not even before that. So it's not ideal, but every year there's at least one young scientist who just laps up the stuff, says that this changed their lives and changed their ways of thinking. So I keep hoping that there's going to be some sort of fractal effect as these people go out into the world and talk to their own. But I'm not joking about Second Enlightenment. It's a series of nested institutional structures and belief systems that are very, very powerful. That and comforting as well. There's just so many places where we want to buy into the objectivity of things. When I want to do a little tiny lesson, I get students to list 10 times before they came to my class that morning that they trusted in somebody else's expertise. And it extends to all kinds of things. Once you get them thinking about it, they're not thinking about it because they don't realize that when they go into Starbucks and have the milk pitchers, and one says 2% and one says skim and one says whole, that what the sort of edifice of trust is. Why shouldn't Starbucks be diluting its milk? People do this all the time in all kinds of societies. Inspectors, well, we know that USDA can't even inspect its meat. You just think about the sort of structures of trust that have been built up, and then you're trying to get people to think in a sophisticated way. I began a recent article of mine with a quotation from George Eliot from Middlemarch that I've always liked, about how if you have a keen sense and perception of all human life, it would be like hearing the grass grow and the squirrel's heart beat, and you would die of that roar that lives on the other side of silence. So I think, going back to your question, that modernity silences a lot of the squirrel's heartbeat and the sound of the grass growing. And in fact, we would be deafened. Mad people often hear too many signals.
Okay, the last question.
Hi, my name is Marjorie Lavies. Governments rely on corporate science to make many decisions, drug approvals, pesticide approvals, etc. The public is deeply suspicious, or a large faction of them are deeply suspicious of corporate-funded science. And the academic world is very conflicted on the issue of whether or not people who are funded by corporations are doing honest science or not. Can you shed any light on how that dynamic plays out or could play out, or how we might clarify some of those roles and responsibilities?
Again, thank you very much for that question. So firstly, I think that the first two questions that I'm wanting us to excavate under this question of the constitutional role of science would very much look into the kind of thing that you're talking about. So when people say that climate science is being bought by corporations, I don't think people stop to say exactly what you said, which is that there are lots of places where we actually have decided, as a matter of unstated public policy, that the government should not produce a certain kind of thing because we have chosen to say it's not a public good, right? I mean, so we've chosen to say that it's more efficient for a company that's putting a new product on the market to develop the science that's connected to that new product. Mind you, at least in the US, we have not said that those same corporations should pay a tax to produce public knowledge about stuff that is already out on the market. And in the 1970s, when we enacted a decade of laws saying that we should go back and revisit the dangers from already extant things that are out there, we decided that that was public good and public knowledge, and that public science should pay for it. And we gave industry lots and lots of rights to question it, as a result of which our Toxic Substances Control Act of 1976 was completely emasculated because industry constantly questioned EPA's threshold judgment that there actually was a risk enough to warrant asking industry to produce more knowledge about the chemicals that are already out there in circulation. And here it is 2013, and we're still fighting that same battle over the fact that the Europeans have adopted a different and more demanding standard for their chemical industry, and our chemical industry in the US is fighting the European REACH regulations because they go further. So I think all of that kind of stuff, I mean, you know, my questions are small questions, but there's worlds out there. I think in each society we need to get a better understanding. STS scholars need to, but also scientists and engineers, of the very schizophrenic ways in which we have parceled out public and private, and what we consider to be public, what we take to be the public good. People are always astonished. I find my young students are terribly astonished that the vast majority of the things that they use on a daily basis have never been tested. You know, somehow they've grown up with this comforting assumption that whatever they touch has been tested. You know, so every garment, every backpack, every, you know, seat in an airplane, you know, they think that there's this testing apparatus. But then if you go to the public and say, pay for these things, then, you know, it's a conflagration because it's big government and so on and so forth. So, you know, there's really a sort of huge amount of lack of understanding about where we've positioned science and technology in relation to the dispersal of what we take to be public and what we take to be private. I mean, I'll just conclude by saying that when BP came in and wanted the University of California, Berkeley, to do research on biofuels, and it turned out that they wanted a degree of control over things like appointments and first rights of review of research that was coming out. And a lot of people at Berkeley were extremely incensed at this development. The scientists themselves got up and said it was their freedom of speech and their First Amendment rights to get research money from wherever they could. So, I mean, you know, I was very glad that it was my student who was trying to fight this battle at Berkeley and not me, because I think I would have become apoplectic. But, you know, what it speaks to is why I use constitutional language. People themselves are using constitutional language, but with very little understanding of what it is they're talking about and what the underlying political theory is of where the public sphere should begin and end, where the private sphere should begin and end, and how the flow of knowledge across domains should be parceled out. The responsibility to produce, the responsibility to test, the responsibility to raise accusations, if need be, who has the responsibility to pay when there is a legitimate doubt, and which institutions are going to operate on what basis. In the Supreme Court of the U.S., we have court decisions that are not sensitive to what they're actually sorting out when they say this is a decision about evidence. What they're sorting out is the shape of the public sphere in the year 1993 and beyond.
Great. Thank you. I'm going to hand the mic over to my colleague Mark Tyner, who's going to thank you for opening our symposium in a wonderful way. Take it away, Mark.
Thank you. Well, actually, I just here to give you a small gift. But I really have to say that you managed to address the big picture and also do it very precisely. So you actually somehow got around this problem of the holistic and the specialist. And you did give us not all the answers, but very many. So thank you very much. And this is just a small thing for the airplane.